Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to visit with you today. I guess what we're talking about is school funding, and I guess I chaired the interim education funding committee. Our mission was was the last few years. I mean, if you don't remember, when we changed our funding system in the 12-13 year of going from a property-based to a student-based system, and also including a huge amount of property tax relief. In 12-13, we created protections for school districts so that they wouldn't lose a vast amount of money because of school population or because of funding issues. And these protections were called minimums and maximums. And our goal this last session, we said, well, we need to get schools on formula and a way to keep them on there, because we all know of schools that were getting way more than our per pupil payment of $10,000, and it just seemed like it was a flaw in our system. So our goal this interim was to look at our funding formula and to find ways to get schools and to keep schools on formula so that everybody was on an equal playing field and getting paid for what we thought was adequate to fund schools. Um, this last session, what we put into law, we said that schools will be on formula within 7 years, and by doing a straight 15% cut in what they were getting, if they were getting maximums and minimums. Well, what happened with that is that would be very severe to mostly our small schools, or even some of our schools, to really to force the issue. And I guess we never really believed that that was what we were going to do, but we thought it was important to put it into law so that we would to force good discussion to find better ways to get schools and keep schools on formula. So what happened with that, this interim committee, which was put together to solve those issues, we also added some ex-official members of 6 business managers and superintendents from both large and small schools and from our tribal schools. And the idea is that to have discussions with people that live and breathe these issues every day, and to promote discussion. And I think it really did work. And Dr. Holen was part of that group and did provide a lot of information that we needed. Well, as we were going through the discussion of what we were going to do to this came up, we talked about looking at changing the factors of certain small schools. And the amount really hasn't been determined yet, but we were looking at school population of less than 375, or maybe less than that. That hasn't yet been determined. But basically what that would do is that we'd change these factors and use that money that we were paying for minimums, which is about $50 million a biennium. We would have a way to get schools on formula and keep them on there without adversely disaffecting their amounts too drastically. The other thing is if we would use that money and do this, it would also be revenue neutral for the state, so that the state would not have to kick in a whole bunch of new money to fix this problem. So it seemed like a reasonable solution with our revenue shortfalls that we were having. So that's kind of the trend we were looking at. We didn't finalize a bill coming out of that committee, but what we did provide was enough information for the key people in education to at least have an understanding of how factors worked and how the funding formula worked. And by making changes, and every time we make a change that affects somebody, it probably adversely affects somebody else. So we're trying to make ways that to not really adversely affect anybody too bad, and still be revenue neutral within the system, at least for this time. One of the concerns that we looked at is that we're pretty much certain that there's not going to be a lot of money that we can put at education, and of course we'll do whatever we can with what we have. But the other thing was the on-time funding, which is for the second year of the biennium, which is what we're in, is that that is at 50% of on-time funding, and that's supposed to go up by 10% for the next 5 years to get that at 100%. Well, I'm not sure, and this is just a personal opinion, I'm not sure if that will, I believe we'll stay at the 50%. I just don't know if we'll be able to go up to the 10% for the next 2 years after that. And the reason is because that would take quite a bit of money and it would only give it to some schools and not others. So, you know, that's a question that's going to have to. The other thing we found out looking at our enrollment numbers, which are still up somewhat, but they're not up as severely as they were before. So I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing, but the cost to continue now is going to be about $45.5 million, which is a big number, but it's not as big as it has been. So it's also a way to look at how we are going to deal with some of the, I mean, even if we don't do anything, it's still going to cost us $45.5 million more to stay where we're at. And that's if nothing changes. So, you know, those are things that we got to be aware of and plan for. Out of the committee, we did introduce 2 bill drafts that we will be moving forward to the next session. The first one is that we had a discussion of transportation, of busing for kids that are either open enrollment or tuition waivers. And we didn't think that it was right that the state paid for transportation for the kids that were moving out of a district and going somewhere else. So we have a bill draft that says the state will not pay for that kind of transportation. It does not include, you know, special ed or co-ops or any other contract services. It's just kids that choose to go to a different district for whatever reason, and the school can still provide busing. It's just that the state will not pay for that. The second bill draft that's coming out of our interim committee would be an ending fund balance bill, and that's been kind of a hot issue. But what this bill will say is that there was discussions early on, it's probably May and June, when we were getting COVID money or some other money, and schools didn't know exactly you know, what the future held for them, and they had contracts and there were certain things going on, and they didn't want to be dinged with having an excess amount in their ending fund balance, and then because of the 35%, they would be, you know, have to be less state payment. So what this bill draft and what we told schools at that time is says, well, if you can transfer it to your building fund, and this bill draft says that there'll be a one-time opportunity for schools that did that transferred money to the building fund because of the COVID or the pandemic issues that we had. They'll have a one-time opportunity to transfer back that to their general fund without penalties for that ending fund balance rules that we have. That issue will probably be opened up for a lot of reasons, and so I'm sure that we will see some issues on that. I think we need to streamline that. Ending fund balance, the bill that was put into place and made into law was mostly to protect property tax owners and from school districts from bankrolling a large amount of property tax money. But what we've seen because of doing that is that we've created some issues with impact aid and some other grant monies and some other monies that really should not be included in that calculation. So I'm confident that discussion will happen, and that will be some improvements made in the ending fund balance of that money that's left over in reserves, and especially with trying to build schools and not knowing the future, I think a savings account would be a pretty good idea. Some of our current issues that have come up and that we had discussions on was the concerns that schools currently have right now is the contact tracing and the quarantine issues. It seems like the rules were, you know, somewhat unworkable, and that there was needed some adjustments in that. So we're kind of suggesting some things for that you know, a more reasonable approach of things that happens for kids that don't get really don't have symptoms and that. So, you know, and that's kind of the Nebraska and the Iowa model of that. So we kind of suggested some things for that. One of the last other issues was this last go around of COVID money, that the $30 million that you know, their schools were given, but it was only could be used for personnel. Well, that was a great idea, except that most schools can't find personnel, whether it's substitutes or contract services, to actually do that. I mean, there's a lot of places that you know, if you can't find them or they're not willing to work, it doesn't do any good. And since everybody's on a contract or a pay scale, it's pretty hard to go off schedule. So, I mean, it was a good idea, but it's somewhat unworkable. So I'm afraid we're going to have a lot of money that won't be able to be used because we simply can't find the personnel to do that. So I guess that's a very short, in a nutshell, of what's happened in the last year and a half with our interim committee. You know, and I guess that's kind of you know, between what we are trying to fix and the limitations of what we have for revenue and what we're projecting, is going to make for an interesting session. But I think we got ways that, at least, you know, with our savings accounts and some of our funds that we have, we certainly won't have to deduct or go backwards on our schools. I think we have enough room to stay at least where we are, and hopefully to put a little more into schools. And of course, I think the best way to help schools is to increase the per pupil payment, which helps every school and helps every kid. So with that, I will answer any questions, or I will turn it over to Steve.
Questions, Brent? Chad? Doesn't appear to be, so, okay, thanks. Thank you, Senator Schaible. Next up is Dr. Steve Holen, a past board member of the Western Dakota Energy Association and still a current member of the WDEA Education Committee. Steve served this past interim as an ex officio member of the Education Funding Formula Review Committee, and will be offering his thoughts on school funding challenges in the West. Monitor is yours, Dr. Holen.
All right, thanks, Shannon. Thanks for having me. And I do want to start by thanking Senator Schaible, members of the Interim Funding Committee, for allowing myself and other superintendents and school officials to serve ex facto on that committee. That was a tremendous experience. I think it was a great effort on their part to include us in that process and to take our input. We always appreciate being at the table and providing information regarding what's happening in the field. So I really appreciate their efforts, not only in being in that interim funding committee process, but also in the legislative session, this last session. We found that we do have support. Our voice is being heard in many realms. We don't get every issue resolved, but we are making progress in certain areas. And we do continue to appreciate the support we're getting from our representatives at the legislative level. I did want to bring up, in case in point to that, then with successes, the sinking in interest component that was passed, we're very appreciative of that effort. And we did get support from Senator Schaible, Senator Rust, and others to get that through. We are seeing the positive impacts of that. It may not seem like a huge thing, but I've been on the committee for quite a while. The idea of the gross production tax being exempt from the subtraction on the foundation aid formula is a significant issue. This was the first effort to recognize that. And with that, then we are starting to understand that the in lieu of funds do support general operating, but they have no support in terms of passing bond referendums or otherwise. They're not represented at that point. So this was an effort to support getting bond referendums passed by letting that significant in lieu of revenue be used for that purpose. So those funds can go toward debt and not be counted against us for general operating. So that was a significant move. I think there's room for more improvement in that process and needs to be continued to considered. The more we move toward the in lieu of revenue for our schools being treated as a tax and a property tax as they are in all realms is a success for us. So appreciate those efforts and hope to see more on that level. On-time funding, Senator Schaible mentioned that was a success because of a lot of the growth that was going on in our area. Getting at 50%, of course, it would be great to be at 100%, but it's a huge challenge even to get to 50%, so we recognize that. And also, effort that continues on the construction loan process is helpful. But as far as challenges, to start at that level, with the construction loans, Brent mentioned it before as well. Any mechanisms we have at the local level to pass bond referendums that reduce the property tax load are obviously beneficial. Those do because of the low interest. It gets a little bit muted because of how well the bond rates are doing at certain times. So it's not quite as enticing in that regard. But at the same time, we appreciate the effort, and we do always look toward grants. The impact grants that were available previously were huge assets for us, and I know we utilized them very, very well with getting our other projects accomplished. So anything that would go toward that effort going in the future is greatly appreciated because it does equate to direct property tax relief. The way it was set up about 2 sessions ago was that it had to be used toward debt in some capacity or infrastructure, and those were well utilized, and they do get noticed when we look at our mills and our general impact of our taxpayers. So we think those should warrant some continued effort. As you looked at that, Senator Schaible described very well the work of the committee, and it was pretty much to try to address getting schools on the formula. And the transition payments is a huge part of that. That does affect some of our Western North Dakota schools. But I guess my focus will be on that 60 mil deduct. That has made probably the biggest impact on a lot of our Western North Dakota schools because we were in that dynamic of some are getting forced into lower mill levies because of the valuation changes that occurred in our areas, which are generally very positive as far as their tax base growing. But the way that the mill works, that we all know, it does drive those mills down because of the 12% cap that's also placed on schools as far as how much you can increase your mill levy in dollars. So the wording of the bill does provide that 7 years of which to get schools back to 60 mills. And the concern obviously in Western North Dakota was it's a direct shift from state funding to local funding. This is about $20 million plus that the state is funding for our operating to offset that would go directly back to the local level as those local mills would increase to 60. So it was a difficult discussion. The committee was always very open to the perspectives on that. And again, a lot of that in Western North Dakota relates to the idea that the perception when you just look on paper and you see maybe 40 general fund mills and you say, that's just, not right. That's not equity. Not taking into account some of the lieu of funds. The lieu of funds do reduce some of the dependence on local property taxes, and that's not a bad thing. That's kind of the nature of what they were designed for. But it skews when you look at the state level, I guess, if you look at just individual property tax equity and support for schools. So the challenge there really in the bigger picture is that school districts have been used and school funding has been used for property tax relief. And we understand why it's been used in that purpose, but it does blur the line now of whether we're talking about equity in school funding or we're talking about equity in property tax distribution. And so that becomes just really the difficult discussion to have. So, but that is still in effect. All of our schools are faced with that climb up to 60 mills. The timing can be very challenging at times. I mean, our local economies are depressed at this time, and then to see schools raising taxes. But that is the nature of what we are in a greater degree forced to do as far as that general fund levy. So I know there's usually a lot of questions about that or otherwise. We continue to have that dialogue. It is a little bit complicated as far as working through that process of how the formula, yes, it is a little bit of a benefit in the formula to be below that 60. I know it's designed to be at 60. Going back to 12, 13, I'm sure they've probably been some provisions to keep it at 60, but now that it's dropped, there aren't a lot of easy solutions to get schools back up to that. So that continues to be a challenge that we do at the local level. And I don't foresee, although we continue to have that dialogue, if there'll be any changes to that. So we'll continue to see schools making that pitch. The way that valuations work is probably a really big concern. A lot of us get essentially assessed property as part of our tax base. When we look at all those numbers as far as production decreases, a concern from the local level is property tax valuations going down. We've had the luxury of them going up for quite a few years, but some individual school districts have already seen some of those declines. And they can happen pretty rapidly if you have larger sections of centrally assessed property that is reduced. That becomes immediate impacts on the locals and would impact that 60 mills obviously also, but in that way, we're going to get to 60 mills much quicker than even the incentive. So we always knew that was the case. Valuation going up is great. We know it won't last forever. Once it curtails and starts to flatline or go down, the mills will start to go up automatically. So whether or not the bill or valuations get us to 60 mills quicker, I guess that'll yet to be determined. Transportation becomes, again, a challenge that Senator Schaible mentioned. And on our level too, it's just the funding level. I know for our larger districts like ourselves, geographically, we get probably about 25 to 30% of our funding reimbursed at the state level for our transportation system. And obviously that we'd like to see that a little bit higher. You can say it's elective, but you can't say it in our school district. It's required. We do have to operate a transportation system. It's not something we would choose not to be able to do because of the impacts on our families. Cost of construction has always come up. At the Legacy Fund meeting that was in Wofford City, there were some fresh numbers that were shared. And it was interesting to see that, I guess the best data that was available at the time, there was about well over $100 a square foot difference between Southeast North Dakota and Northwest North Dakota in regards to construction based on rates and numbers that have been seen to date. So I know anecdotally, it's always been shared that it's more expensive to build out Northwest North Dakota and western part of North Dakota. I think we started to get some articulation of that, of the reality of it. And even some of it being even more than the 35% that we used for some of those numbers. So that continues to be a concern, obviously with current dynamic. I mean, construction gets put to the side, but we think it will come back again. We do believe that in the long run, we will see continued growth. So I think we need to take a look at that legislatively still, as far as accounting for that in some way. The impact grants used to help do that. They're no longer available. So that cost of construction is borne at our local levels and is not equitable as far as across the state. We'll probably continue to talk a little bit about the subtraction. Like I said, we've had some success with seeking an interest and how that works across the board. We still get 75%. They're all at 75% now, which is a positive, but whether or not 75% is always what it should be or designed to be will always be a little bit of a debate. And I'll just leave with a few things going forward. We are concerned about some enrollment shifts. The pandemic did put some homeschool numbers higher than normal. You of course hope to get some of those homeschool students back, but we also know that that was a trend even before the pandemic of homeschool populations a little bit. So I think that there are some things to consider with homeschool as far as what's been, I guess, enticing for them, I guess, with legislatively or otherwise to go to that route, to still support the public school effort on that. Career academies were talked about with the Legacy Fund, and I know that dialogue has changed dramatically, but I think there's still that need. I think there's still a workforce need in our areas, and schools play a part of that. Everything gets paused a little bit now, but when we had the previous slowdown, it ramped back up again quicker than we thought, and the workforce issues were back as quickly as they left. And so during the slowdowns now, it's a great time to start building that workforce need, and career academies do a great job of that. So we really want to hope we see some of that brought back, because there's some very good opportunities in Western North Dakota to support those career academy concepts. Mental health will continue to come back. That was an issue before pandemic, and you could well imagine after pandemic what our student mental health issues we're facing are. We need support in that tremendously, and as we're coming back to school, we're having even more challenges to meet the mental health needs of our students. So we're going to have those questions to talk about again. Senator mentioned contact tracing. Right now, I think if you named one of the top issues for a school administrator dealing with today, it is probably the complex and debated issue of contact tracing. It's great that parents want to send their students to public school, and we want to welcome them with open arms, and we do not take lightly sending them home for 14 days to not receive in-person instruction, which we know is the best method. So we do balance public health and the health of our students and staff, but at the same time, we want our students to get the best opportunity possible. So I think we need to look at that. I think schools are put into a difficult dilemma of trying to make local decisions, but trying to follow guidelines. So any support legislatively to work with the Department of Health on providing more flexibility in that process, I think would be greatly appreciated by everyone, in particular some of our schools in Western North Dakota. So I do think that's an issue. I was glad to hear Senator Schaible mention that level of support, because that we do need some of that locally, because of some of the issues we're trying to work through that are not in our wheelhouse when you talk about public health. So we need some support at the state level to help us navigate the challenges right now. And that's probably about it. Again, we continue to Western North Dakota, the challenges is some of the up and down. planning in a environment now. We were ramping up for growth, and we just completed our new elementary school. And now you look at a situation of somewhat anxiety of what the industry is doing. And then you still look at long-term plans of how do you continue to plan long-term when it's difficult to project with this industry or otherwise, which you all face. So that continues to be a challenge, but we still need the resources and the help planning so that we don't get behind, because when we do nothing during a slowdown and it ramps back up again, we're back where we started and still being behind. So we try to move forward during slowdowns so we don't face those challenges of overcrowdedness and that when it comes back and then it becomes overwhelming. So anyway, I'll leave it up for questions at that point. I don't know if that was everything that was needed to be covered, but again, appreciate the opportunity, appreciate the support of the association, WDEA, and the legislators that are supporting and looking out for Western North Dakota. We know it's a challenge, but we appreciate when you reach out and include us in the conversation so we can provide the input. So anyway, I'll answer any questions if any came across, Shannon, or otherwise.
Questions, Brent? Or not appear to.
Don't see any questions right now.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, and thanks again, Senator Schaible. And I do not envy with the road you got ahead of you with this stuff. So.